My name's Sharon Lockyer. I'm the Director of the Centre for Comedy Studies Research based here at Brunel University, London. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Comedy in the Classroom, You Must Be Joking. I want to sort of express probably a warm and extended welcome to our external guests. Because I know there's a lot of you who've come from off campus just for this event, so I really appreciate you making the effort and coming along this afternoon. So Comedy in the Classroom, You Must Be Joking is very much a collaboration between the Centre for Comedy Studies Research based here and also Department of Education based here on campus as well. And we're delighted to be working in partnership with the Learning and Teaching Symposium that's been taking place all day. And we're honoured to be closing the event with this discussion around comedy in the classroom. The VC and President reminded us this morning in the opening welcome that from its very conception in 1966, Brunel was renowned, and its unique selling point was very much about engaging students in their learning and teaching. So I think it's quite apt and fitting that we're talking about those potentials in terms of comedy, engaging students in their teaching and learning and their student experience on campus today. So I'm hoping it's something that you can all benefit from as well. I'd like to highlight that it's the potential use of comedy, but also the limits of comedy and the potential risks of using comedy in the classroom. And we've got an esteemed panel of experts who are going to share their thoughts and experiences with us. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Anne Chappell, who's from the Department of Education, who's going to chair this afternoon's event. So over to you, Anne.
It is great to see people, so thank you very much, because I know it's been a long day as well and a very interesting and exciting day, and sometimes that's exceptionally tiring. So we're very, very pleased that people have been able to stay. A couple of things just to start with. We would be delighted if you would tweet. So up on the slide behind me, there is a Twitter address for the Department of Education and also for the Centre for Comedy Studies and also for the event today, which is Brunel Teaching. So we'd be very, very pleased for you to do that. As Sharon said, this has been part of a seminar series for the year, which has been really interesting for me to participate in. It's been delightful to work with both Sharon and Simon. And we've been involved in some really interesting events so far this year, and this is going to be a fabulous one. We've been very much looking forward to it. It's also very timely because there have been a couple of things recently in the press around the interest about comedy and in the classroom. So Harry Hill made a comment about teachers and stand-up comedians and the interesting potential parallels between them in terms of the kind of work that they do. And certainly from the keynote this morning, there were some links to that in terms of things being fun. So that's quite an interesting starting point for us. And also, the Dave channel, that very esteemed TV channel, they are currently working on a series of having stand-up comedians present their comedy as lectures. So that's also going to be a really interesting thing in terms of turning things around the other way. Now, we called this session Comedy and the Classroom because classrooms can be very funny places. Funny things happen in classrooms, but also, as Sharon identified, there's also the issue about the comedy that you bring to the classroom, that you use as a pedagogic tool. And hopefully, in the discussion this afternoon, we'll be able to think a little bit more about that. Now, at the start, you had scrolling on the right and left-hand side, which you may well have seen, some words. And those words that you were seeing are drawn from Berger's work about techniques of humour. And Berger categorises these 40-something techniques of humour under these 4 headings, which are language, logic, identity, and action. And what those are different ways that comedy can be used. So that was quite an interesting thing when we were thinking about the seminar, to frame this today, to be thinking about the different ways in which comedy can be used, and indeed is used, in terms of pedagogic and teaching strategies. For those of you, like I, for whom comedy, I love it, but I don't know theoretically very much about it until I've been participating in this year, to understand what comedy is in terms of its kind of theoretical understandings and theoretical descriptions. So the ideas around comedy and comedy making people and things seem ridiculous in these three particular kinds of ways. So thinking about positions of superiority, so the laugher is amused by somebody else, so their kind of positioning in that. Incongruity, so things that are not as we expect them to be, things that are not as they seem, and defying our expectations. And also this idea of masked aggression or relief, so a mechanism for expressing things that we might not find very easy to express. And they provide another interesting framing, really, for today, and thinking about the ways in which those operate. Now, we know that comedy gets lots of attention in relation to classrooms in popular media. So those of you who've enjoyed things like Derry Girls and the kind of classroom antics that go on there, as part of a much bigger story, of course. There are episodes of Friends where Ross, in his kind of lecturer capacity, is an object of mockery, and so is his classroom. And also other sitcom type things and comedy shows that have been constructed around young people, potentially, and the different positions that they might occupy. It's also become increasingly of interest in academia. So the idea of academic members of staff being encouraged to present their research in a 1-minute stand-up format has been something that's also been interesting. So there's an awful lot of relevance to the kind of practices in teaching and the learning environment. The thing that is important to think about in the classroom setting, however, are the dynamics of that, which we will certainly be exploring this afternoon, and the ideas of the way in which power operates in classrooms. So teachers can be viewed as powerful, and there are power dynamics between those who know and those who don't, potentially. There are also power dynamics between students and the different kinds of interactions that happen there, which leads me back to the point that I made earlier around comedy and the classroom, and that classrooms can be funny places, but also these pedagogical tools can be used in these settings. And the power dynamics in there are really important considerations for us. So that's just to frame the kinds of things that we want to consider this afternoon, and you all had access to the kind of questions that the panellists had been given to think about in terms of what they're going to share with you this afternoon. But what I'd like to do is welcome our panellists. So we have Hannah Ballou, Martin Billingham, Lee Finton-Clear, Shazia Mirza, and Lee Campbell. And we are really delighted, as Sharon said earlier on, an esteemed panel. We're so delighted that these people were able to come together this afternoon to share their ideas and thoughts with you and to stimulate the discussion. They're going to speak or present for around 10 to 12 minutes, and then Lee, as the discussant, is going to offer some thoughts and ideas on the basis of that, and then we're going to open the floor to discussions, and I'm hoping that it'll be a really rich and interesting discussion this afternoon. So thank you again. I'm going to start, with no further ado, by introducing you to Hannah. So Hannah Ballou, a comedian, a performance artist, a researcher and a lecturer at Kingston University, London. Hannah's live art practices mix neo-burlesque and stand-up comedy with audience participation. So we eagerly await. Hannah.
Hi, thank you, Anne. Thank you for inviting me. I was just quickly deleting my introductory paragraph as she was saying what I was going to introduce myself. But yeah, my name is Dr. Hannah Ballou, and I'm going to do a deep dive into some of my practices of research, and then hopefully I'll have time to bring it around to kind of what I would consider maybe a more universally applicable strategy for comedy in the classroom. But the practice as research that I'm going to screen some documentation from, it's called The Doctor Is In, which it's a show I made for the 2018 Calm Down Dear Festival of Feminist Performance at Camden People's Theatre. And for context, the show, it's doing several different things. It's an exploration of the performativity of the comic pedant archetype. Okay, so I used Il Dottore from the Commedia dell'arte as a muse to create a show that in the middle of my first year in post as a lecturer, and the show sort of critiques casualization, discrimination against women and particularly mothers in academia, and the student as consumer model of higher education. And let me back up a bit. Il Dottore, if you're not familiar, he is the pompous academic who will lecture ad nauseum about anything that he knows nothing about. Right. So the concept for the show is that I've set up a feminist GP surgery on stage, and my audience had to fill out forms. Intake forms, sort of listing their minor and major complaints about the patriarchy, and I treated them. And the particular section that I'm going to screen is the result of an experiment. In my own classes, I decided to ask my students for feedback on me personally. I contextualize these as very sort of separate from. Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Is that annoying? Should I keep talking? I'll keep talking. Okay. So I definitely separated this exercise from legitimate student voice exercises like module evaluation questionnaire, national student survey, etc. This was contextualized as an artistic collaboration. It was anonymous, and the students were, they consented to their submissions being used as material in the performance and then other research outcomes. They were encouraged to be hyperbolic and amusing, as long as it is what they really thought about me, with license for comic exaggeration. And the audience in the house, just for more context, it's comprised of a mix of my students, some colleagues, and then mostly just festival attendees. So let's roll the clip. Oh, shall I? Another satisfied patient. Satisfaction is very important. When my department got really good results in the NSS, the National Student Survey last year, my boss was so happy he had them tattooed on his forehead. But the problem with these sort of national standardized tests is that they're much more about sort of the course content and delivery and student experience, and they're less about me. But I asked some of my students last term to provide some anonymous feedback with the understanding that I could use it in my show if I wanted to. I asked them, what do you really think of Dr. Baloo? And I have divided their responses into 6 categories. They are pedagogical feedback, mental health related, extreme dissatisfaction, lavish praise, borderline inappropriate lavish praise, and of course complaints about feminism. So I'm just going to go through some of the highlights for you here. Under pedagogical feedback, creates an atmosphere of never being able to be completely right or completely wrong. I'm not sure if this is a good thing. It is. She's all right, I guess, lol JK. Hella shady, but a great teacher. I'll take it. The greatest gift you've given me is a source for anger to use for emotional memory exercises. It's all part of the pedagogy. Moving on to mental health. I don't know if you're cool, scary, shady, or insane. It's cool, good job. Dr. Hannah Ballou forced us to eat bananas in class and encouraged moaning while we did that. If that's not a sign of dementia, I don't know what is. That is a Philippe Gaulier clown exercise. I didn't just randomly make them eat bananas.
talk to, like a friend or a therapist. Outfit is working. Moving on to extreme dissatisfaction. Listen, Hannah, I think you're a lovely person, but you're not a good teacher. I did enjoy your lectures very much. Okay. But I recommend you sit in on one of Jim's lectures because he knows how to teach us. Okay, I love this one because it's really long. It's got lots of like well-made points, but then it comes together with a really succinct conclusion in the end, which is good writing. It says, "Nice person can't teach." Let's move on to the lavish praise. A beautiful and open-minded person who pushes you to your limits in order for you to reach your potential. Quirky, hard-hitting American, that's my Twitter bio. If you was a Spice Girl, you would be Scary Spice. Okay? A bubbly bundle of dynamic energy that presents extreme knowledge and craft in a beautiful, complete vessel, translating subtle undertones of liberal democracy, making you feel comfortable and free. Dr. Hannah Ballou, forever. So if drama doesn't work out for that student, they have a bright future as a sommelier. Okay, borderline inappropriate. Kind of want to be her, to be honest, but also want to be with her. An icon. I love you so much. You are so inspiring for female performers. Helpful, approachable, hilarious, smart. I know I've only known you for a few weeks, and this is starting to sound like a love letter, but I'm so glad I stumbled upon you, upon a teacher like you. You're such a good role model. Good thing this is anonymous. Lest my ego becomes too inflated, Hannah looks like end of mode. And then moving on to the inevitable complaints about feminism. I think she talks about feminism excessively. To be fair, we were at the end of a 3-week unit on feminist performance, which I do know quite a bit about, but not enough to teach it without talking about feminism. But I'll work on it. Doesn't talk about anything except feminism. Has an issue with the fact that Peppa Pig wears a dress. That's reductive, but not fair. Makes me feel too nervous to come to lectures because I don't believe in feminism. I know, that one's grim. Not for me, for them. And for the world. But, fortunately, much like an evangelical Christian God, you don't have to believe in feminism for feminism to believe in you. Unlike your average monotheistic deity, however, feminism will rarely suggest that dying for it is a good thing. But of course, people do. Do you know who this is? This is Dr. George Tiller. And anybody who recognizes that name might correctly assume we will temporarily be moving away from the comedy. Dr. Tiller is from my home state of Kansas. We went to the same university. And he was assassinated by a right-wing anti-abortion extremist. At the time of his murder, Dr. Tiller's clinic was one of only 3 in the United States that would perform late-term abortions, and this made him a target of anti-abortion protests and violence. In the 1980s, his clinic was firebombed, and while it was being rebuilt, he hung up a sign that said, "Hell no, we won't go." In the 1990s, he survived a previous assassination attempt. He was shot 5 times while in his car, and he carried on. And then eventually he was fatally shot in 2009 in the head while he was ushering at his church's Sunday service. And that is what a feminist doctor looks like. And as a woman from Kansas, I am honor-bound to make sure that the world does not forget his sacrifice. So the next time a student complains about me because I bang on about women, I will keep things in perspective. So, before we say goodbye, maybe we should like.
In my second year at Kingston, I decided to, I actually disseminated, I did it again, but I disseminated the results at the students' own sort of cabaret that they'd invited me to perform at. And I think that performing it in their artistic space, as opposed to sort of my own gig, kind of strengthened the exchange of productive ridicule. And I'm not suggesting that this is a strategy that everyone should roll out, because it takes sort of confidence in your ability to generate and perform the material. But I found it to be an enriching way to sort of synergize my my teaching, my research, and my practice. And I will just quickly finish by briefly outlining, as I said, another strategy for comedy in the classroom that I think can be sort of universally applied. And that is by asking a very simple question to your students. Why is that funny? I start by teaching them the basics of the incongruity theory of humor, which Anne just touched on earlier, which it considers comedy to be an oscillation back and forth between two incompatible interpretations of a concept, or a playful manipulation of ideas and activities so that they're simultaneously perceived in opposing ways. So when the students, when the students find something funny, whether it's something I brought into a lecture or just a comment that one of them makes out of the blue, I get them to analyze, what are those two ideas that are incongruous? What is not lining up? Why is that funny? And once they've identified what that disconnect is, then they can evaluate whether it is reinforcing perhaps a systemic oppression, inequality, or social norm that they're not actually on board with ethically or politically. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. That was a great start. In terms of our next speaker, Martin Billingham is a stand-up comedian, educator and academic with specialist interests in the interrelationship between education and stand-up comedy. He's currently studying a master's degree at UCL, specialising in oracy, dialogic learning and group work, which in relation to the things that I was talking about earlier on are really quite fascinating. So Martin. Okay.
Hello. Okay, good, right, okay. So, just want to talk a little bit about me, who I am, my background, what I care about, and hopefully stimulate some good discussion and questions with the panel. So, I always wanted to do stand-up comedy, but I never had the guts. But then I found myself teaching English in Spain, and I realized that there's a connection between teaching and stand-up comedy. You're stood up in front of a group of people and you're interacting with them. You have prepared material that you have to adapt to that group at that time in that room. As a teacher, you're prompting, you're eliciting. You are finding a way to interact with the people right in front of you. So I came back to the UK and I did a master's degree in stand-up comedy at the University of Kent. Yes, that's a thing. And I just want to share a little bit of what I found out there. So in terms of teaching as a type of performance, I mean, it's quite popular amongst academics, but exactly what kind of performance it is unknown. This is where I found Kevin McCarran, who is an English Lit major. I think he's still at Roehampton. And he posits that it's only teachers and stand-up comedians that require continuous performative interaction between themselves and the groups that they're working with. So I also found John Morial, who's a American philosopher, a brilliant book called The Philosophy of Humour. He posits that humour in the classroom does all these useful things. He suggests that it builds adaptive, divergent, and critical thinking. It relieves stress, builds rapport, all of these things on the screen. But in particular, his suggestion was that humour works very well in skills-orientated classrooms. Now, what that means is a class that has to try an activity where it's very likely to make lots of false starts, lots of failure, trying again, trying something new. And I thought that was really interesting. But my angle is really this. Of course, stand-up comedy is about humour. Yes. Of course, stand-up comedy, the purpose of it, number one, is to be funny and to get laughs. But what a stand-up comedian actually does is interactive, adaptive, and dynamic dialogue. Fundamentally, teaching and stand-up comedy do not exist without that interactive dialogue. Also, in terms of learning, this is kind of interesting. In 2014, I think it was Franklin, Professor Franklin he did an experiment in terms of putting people into an MRI machine to scan their brains while they were watching stand-up comedy. And the suggestion from that was that being an audience member while watching stand-up comedy, it actually activates lots of interesting parts of the mind, of the brain. That you are accessing social cultural memory in order to get the joke. You're accessing social emotional understanding. Is this funny here, now, with these people in front of me? Being part of a stand-up comedy audience is not a passive act. It's a participatory one. Not only are you reacting in terms of do you laugh or not, do you boo or not, do you cry or not, but internally you're actually experiencing something that's like a kind of mental workout. So my position is that being an audience member in a stand-up comedy gig is much more interactive than you might think. So what I do, I train teachers in particular, but also PhD students and lecturers in public speaking. It's really just stand-up comedy, what I do. The thing is, yes, of course, it's about building confidence, and it's a bit about mic technique, like I'm doing now. But really, in stand-up, there's this thing called find your voice. Now, what does that mean? That sounds really grandiose. What that means is working out the persona within the person. What is it about this person that engages them with an audience? So what I'm doing now, I'm working with an international group in which we're training teachers through stand-up comedy, then letting them go back into the classroom and trying to understand what the effect of it is. Is there any improvement? Has the communication improved? Has the learning improved? So the background for these guys is really applied theatre. So I suppose what I'm kind of positing today is applied stand-up comedy. Is that a thing? I've just said it. If enough people say it, it's a thing. Here's just a couple of nice little pictures from the previous events that they did in terms of applied theatre. And of course, it's to do with science communication. This is linked with the University of Malta, the University of Athens. It will also be going into Belgium, and it's meant to go into the UK this week, but Brexit. So this is what I'm doing right now. So I'm taking, for my sins, another master's degree at the Institute of Education, UCL, in assessment. Now, I know you might be thinking this is a long way away from what I was talking about before, but the purpose of this is to really get the tools and the language to understand, does training in stand-up comedy improve teaching practice? And the simple answer is, there's not enough evidence and we don't know yet. Hopefully, I'm going to get there first. If I get the funding. Please, somebody fund me. So at the IOE, I'm really focused on that. When we talk about dialogue, that's really just what we think of as conversation, speaking and listening. But the proper academic term is dialogue. And what I'm also doing, I'm working with Cambridge at the moment, because they've codified dialogue, which I'm of two minds about, if I'm honest. But it's a good first step if you're going to build a structure to assess how dialogue works. So I'm currently also building a piece of software to let teachers understand the state of dialogue in their classrooms. My theory is essentially this. If we can train initial teacher trainers through stand-up comedy to be more confident in speaking in front of a group of people, and some of the skills and tips and tricks that stand-up comedians use, will it improve their ability to interact? Will it improve their ability to use dialogic learning? And if it improves their ability, can we then move on to students, understand their ability to interact and talk and work together, and improve their dialogic learning scenario? So that's me. I'm very happy to answer any questions with the panel. If you want to see some online stuff, look. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin, very much. So our next speaker is Fintan Clear, who is based at Brunel, senior lecturer in the Brunel Business School, and he's got a particular research interest in the role of theatrical methods and how that can be used to animate learning. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Make sure I can work this properly. Yes, okay, thanks very much, everyone. Yes, I've been here for a number of years, and it occurred to me that, you know, in order to cut through lots of kind of noise that, in a sense, all students get, especially messages that they've heard so many times before, you know, this word employability, that we ought to try a new approach. So we have large cohorts. When I started here, we had a large class of 60 students. But then it suddenly went up to like 180, 200. And it's a very different kind of skill, I think, working with larger numbers. It's more like crowd control, whereas, you know, when Martin was talking before, when you have a smaller class, you can have a more kind of intimate relationship with them. So this is very different. Additionally, we were trying to do a talk, if you like, trying to encourage students to make the best of their time at university. And of course, when you're talking to, you know, they're 18, 19, 20, or young adults, there's lots of distractions. And then during induction week, there's lots of noise, there's lots of... So how do you cut through that to make sure that, you know, they really understand the message? And so we had the job of raising awareness about, you know, the possibilities of sources of advice, because there's lots of advice here at this university to help students if they know about it, of course. And also, additionally, we wanted to try and, you know, energize them, galvanize them. So there is a precedence, by the way, not just talk about comedy, but the use of fictional vehicles in order to if you like, carry forward or transmit scientific messages. So, you know, the Archers were conceived way back in 1951, and it was actually a joint venture between the Ministry of Agriculture and BBC Home Service, as it was then. And somebody inspired at a meeting came up with this idea, oh, let's use, you know, fiction to launch it. And that's where the Archers came from. I'm not a big fan of the Archers, by the way, but very soon, it became apparent, apparently, oh, you know, the stodgy bits would come up, and it would be about, you know, some kind of new scientific method for doing, you know, some kind of agricultural method. and it became a bit leaden and a bit boring. Anyway, point being that after a few years, the Ministry of Ag left, and the BBC carried on with it. And of course, you know, I do occasionally hear it today. You do hear, don't you, how they discuss latest scientific methods to do with agriculture, all the rest of it. So it's not as though these things haven't been done before. We were having, at the time I was working, I was responsible for work placement students at the business school, and we couldn't understand it. We were actually suffering a decrease in the numbers of students electing to take up work placements. Now, maybe it was because of perhaps the introduction of fees, and students wanted to, you know, get through their 3 years as quickly as possible. But as many people will know who have a link with this, with placements, placements actually help students to learn about the workplace. And then when they come back in their final year, it makes it a much more vibrant kind of experience for them. And also they've got a better chance of getting jobs after. So it was my job, if you like, trying to encourage students to think again. And also to think about building employability. Employability isn't something that happens just the day after they graduate. It's something they need to think about all the way through. And of course it includes all the things you learn in a degree, such as communication, numeracy, ability to stand and make presentations, all these kind of things. So it's all part and parcel. So we wanted to energize them on that. And of course they didn't know very much about what was actually at Brunel. So rather than using a kind of a classic instructivist approach where, you know, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do the other, a kind of message that they've heard ad infinitum and probably goes over their heads now, we thought we ought to try and use a kind of a different method of trying to get to, you know, what's that beer advert used to say, to get to those parts that other beers don't reach? Well, this is to get to those parts other messages don't reach. And so it was to disseminate knowledge about workplace and possibilities, other aspects of the university, and also not just to tell them about it, but get them to do something about it. And it's just like Martin was saying, this idea of a cognitive, I think you call it cognitive, what was it? Sorry, I missed the term. Cognitive engagement. You know, the idea being you've got to do some work. And so the learner constructs, if you like, their own understanding of what's being said. So it's not just words coming over them, but because of the use of humor, you know, comedy, theatre, they're building, they have to do the work themselves. And just as Martin was saying, this idea that, you know, if you go to stand-up, you have to engage with it and you have to work. And so this is what students would have to do in this situation. They have to work and to understand the humour. You know, they'd have to put things together. So they have to construct this in their own heads and to make, you know, and to find something amusing, I suppose. So this is the point behind it. So, and, you know, lots of theory around this idea that that they have to build their own knowledge, and it's, you know, through observation, through listening, all these kind of things. And so motivation, you know, it's so important, isn't it, in students? We don't just want students to be passive, just sit there, and you know, we want them to have a good experience. And it seemed to be, this is axial to their engagement. And see if I can read my own notes. I might have think here. And participation, that's right, in their own, you know, students need to take charge of their own learning. This is the point. They need to take ownership of their own intellectual path to some extent. They can't just sit there and take what's been given to them. So this is, again, part of the rationale behind the use of this. And this is just an image from the actual event that took part a number of years ago now, actually. And this is the difference between, I think, as well, seeing something on a screen and actually being there. Because the buzz, you can see the look on their faces. Live performers cast a spell over something's missing, and there was a heightened awareness. I'm sorry, I lost half of that. But the point being, you know, there's nothing like live performance. You're here, you're there. It's you know, you're part of what's happening, and there's a bit of a buzz. So this is part of the use of this idea of use of, you know, theatre and comedy. So here's an example. In instructivist mode, that people would say, make sure you make your covering letter specific to the firm you're applying to, for example. Whereas a constructive approach would be, you have a vignette, shows two HR people looking over CVs and covering letters, and then laughing at poorly drawn up covering letter, which is then promptly put in the bin. Now that, to me, is going to make a stronger impression and impact on the individual than something that's just told them, which they might have heard so many times before. And so there were two, I won't go into all of this, but I've had two cracks at this. One was a thing called Bursting the Brunel Bubble, where we had about, over 2 sessions, 187 students, first year and second year, by 120 first year and the rest second year. And a more recent experiment was use of a thing called Animating Employability, where these were actually 4 first-year drama students, and they were working with a script prepared by one of our PhD students, in fact, Sharon's PhD student, Christopher Molyneux. But going back to the first Bursting the Brunel Bubble, so the employability message using theatre and comedy is used to build awareness and promote deep reflection on employability issues. So we had standard dramatic vignettes, we had quizzes, and we also used forum theatre. And just to reiterate, so these are the different types of approach we used. We had monologue, dialogue, mime, we had quizzes, and we had forum theatre. And so just to get a bit of evidence of what people thought, for example, 88% strongly agreed or agreed with this proposition that, would you recommend this to your friends, for example? So this event, it lasted 2.5 hours. I mean, that's quite a long time, isn't it, to keep people happy with something. And then, did you have a greater understanding of employability as a result of this session? And 75% either strongly agreed or agreed with this proposition. And then to think about, we were trying to also suggest, you need to get involved in things, university activities, for example, and something like 66%, I think, 60% either strongly agreed or agreed, to also work with, get part-time work, and again, something like 60% agreed with this, or strongly agreed. And also we were talking about voluntary work, and a lower figure, something like 50% either strongly agreed and agreed with this proposition. So fundamentally, and here are some more free-form responses, something like 37% of the 887 responses had some people filling in. And as you can see, lots of words like engaging, easy to absorb the point being made, funny, engaging, very informative, useful, engaging and informative, very motivating, gain some insight, useful insight into workplaces in a fun and entertaining way, cool stuff. You can tell it's genuine because someone not of my generation would say that. Great session, should have more of them. Excellent, I thoroughly enjoyed it, thank you for all the time. Yeah. So, we had a lot of positive response to this. And there were a couple of people who thought, I just put this in because not everyone loves it, but too much comedy, too much theatre nonsense. That's the one I love the most. But basically, there are only 2, therefore, who really didn't like the method out of all of the respondents. And it is indicative of the fact that, yes, comedy perhaps isn't useful necessarily at all times for all people. The ancient Greeks apparently looked down on comedy. They much preferred tragedy, regarded as much more noble. And also, there is a cultural perspective. Some peoples don't necessarily appreciate comedy in a kind of a didactic or rather educative milieu. So, there needs to be more research done on that. And just as a power of persuasion, here on the left you've got a number of sandwich degree students. Those are students doing the 4-year variant with the 3rd year taking a placement. Those are the ones, this is at the beginning of their university career, who had signed up for it. And you see 120 had done that, and 60 had signed up for the non-sandwich degree scheme. Well, by the end of this learning events, the majority of those 60 have decided we're going to change to the sandwich degree variant. So it's got persuasive power as well then. So, just to conclude, so certainly it was popular, and it's a good means of knowledge dissemination. Getting to those parts, as I said, that perhaps other messages don't necessarily get to, especially if they've heard it again and again and again and again. It's good for the student experience, and as regards impact on learning, yes, some more research needs doing. But I would also posit that it helps develop the sense of community and a learning environment where people try and help each other. So anyway, thank you very much.
So Lee has the unenviable job of presenting the kind of discussion. So he's acting as our discussant, and we're very pleased that Lee could join us. An artist and lecturer at the University of Arts London with research interests in critical performative pedagogies, and Lee's forthcoming edited collection, Leap into Action, Critical Performative Pedagogies in Art and Design Education, published by Peter Lang, explores comedy in the classroom. So Lee, over to you.
Shall I present here?
Wherever you feel most comfortable.
Is the microphone over there? Yeah, it's probably easier to do it. Great. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the organisers for such an interesting afternoon. I've really enjoyed listening to the different presentations. My interest in humour and comedy comes from my real interest in heckling. I wrote a PhD on heckling, and please feel free to interrupt me if you think what I'm saying is shit, but do also interrupt me if I go over 10 minutes. So just to try to bring things together, I've made some notes on sort of commonalities, common threads that have sort of run through some of the presentations, and I'll interweave that with some of my own personal narrative in how I've explored comedy in both well, I suppose in terms of my performative art practice, but more in terms of pedagogy and the sort of quite tricky, often tricky nature of using comedy or different forms of humour, transgressive humour in the classroom. And started off by talking about potentials and limits. And I think humour is really interesting as a form of provocation. It can be something which Martin pointed out can be used as a form of provocation. It can be used to engage critical thinking, the way in which John Moriel talks about humour as a provocation of the senses to get students to think about maybe quite difficult subject matter. It can be very much a way in. Martin mentioned two terms, interactive or interaction and dialogic. I'm really interested in humour as a form of dialogue and creating that kind of, particularly in terms of heckling, quite a confrontational dialogue or quite an uncomfortable dialogue. But I'm interested in the performative, in how the linguist John Langham Austin talks about the Speech Act. He talks about the effect of the Speech Act or what language does. He talks about it in terms of the affective force, and the word affect means like the provocation upon one's senses. Basically how language makes you feel. So I'm interested in those moments when I'm teaching. So I teach art, and as I'm teaching context, I like to maybe throw a few things in which might not necessarily make for humour, but might create a reaction which is humorous, but it can also be quite uncomfortable, and I think there's something to unpack there. Finton referred to humour as galvanising or provocation of participation. I think I've certainly experienced that myself when I've been sitting in or giving lectures to students, certainly at the end of the day. And you sort of see those sleepy heads, not because they're not interested in the subject matter, but you can drop in a piece of humour or a comedy joke or something, and you can see the way that it can immediately create a reaction. It can alleviate that sleepiness. Hannah made a point. Why is that funny? Why are the students on board with certain forms of humour or not on board, ethically and politically. And I think that's really interesting in terms of my interest in pedagogy and power dynamics within pedagogy, which Anne referred to. As tutors, we have to really think about creating all the time, maintaining a safe space. And I'm really pleased that my colleague Karen Harris from UAL is here, because we've been talking a lot about this in relation to risk-taking, but also maintaining safe space. And humour's really interesting in thinking around the sort of tension or paradox between creating a safe space but also provoking students outside of their comfort zones to get them to critically engage. I remember my first moment of teaching, which wasn't in higher education, it was teaching like Martin actually in EFL, English as a Foreign Language. And I learned that, particularly in that kind of environment where, particularly amongst a group of strangers, students from different nationalities, different cultural backgrounds, forms of humour or comedy could help to lower their affective barrier. When students are generally more relaxed, it helps them, it frees them to feel more relaxed, to help them to remember certain things. So that helped me to think about the way in which, particularly in terms of laughter, can be used to produce a kind of decrease social tension or decrease interpersonal tension. But also at the same time, and Finton refers to this in terms of community or building groups, to produce potentially social conviviality. Humour as relief, as John Moriel speaks around, can help build social confidence amongst groups of students. It can alleviate anxiety and help pull down social barriers. But I'm really interested, again, to make that point, in that what it means in terms of risk-taking. The tension or even paradox that exists between wanting to create a safe and welcome and inclusive environment and provoking students out of their comfort zones through experimental pedagogy, getting them to critically engage. Don Nielsen has written a lot around humour, his research is within humour, and he talks about the power of humour to in-bond and out-bond. All teaching and learning activities have the capacity to produce forms of comedy, both desirable and undesirable, both planned and unplanned. Humour for me is very much, often I use humour in class, as I've mentioned before, as a form of provocation or as a critical thinking tool. Joe Garner refers to humour as creating moments of ha-ha to aha. It can be seen as a leap into action. John Wright refers to comedy as wrecking anything. And I think about that potentially in terms of how we can use humour or comedy to create these, I suppose, safe spaces where students are relaxed and creating that kind of conviviality. But also, it must be used with caution because it can backfire, undoing the convivial atmosphere that it can be meant to harness. So I think that it can come with a warning. And I've certainly experienced that when students may mistake humour as a personal threat. And I just want to draw upon an anecdote. So I was teaching a class several years ago on the politics of artistic representation, and it was a co-taught session. And at one point, a tutor satirised a Chinese person by putting on the voice of a man of Chinese descent. Performing this satirical impression, grossly caricaturised and heavily stereotypical, it really called into question how humour can so easily disrupt one's ethical compass and steamroll the most well-meaning of intention by causing grave offence. So there was a Chinese student present in the class. Now, he didn't actually find it offensive, but I and other students did find it extremely uncomfortable. And students at the time were laughing. And I asked them, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing, and what are you laughing at? And so, again, using this moment of satire as a critical thinking tool. And that then provoked us to think more about the potential limits of creative expression, or what limits should be placed on creative expression if it causes emotional distress. And just going back to the conversation I had with Karen, my colleague, she mentioned, or we were discussing around ethical responsibility, and humour is so interesting in terms of that. A student in that situation commented, what gives you, so basically my colleague of white British descent, what gives you, someone of a different cultural background, to whom a joke or humour is directed, the right, particularly in a pedagogic setting, in a supposed safe space. We constantly think about issues around emotional stress, emotional distress, emotional well-being. What happens when this was a totally, I suppose it was an act of misjudgment or a moment of naivety on my colleague's part. He didn't think that it would cause so much aggravation, let's say. So Karen mentioned a really interesting point in our conversation, and this question: is it always about who is telling or performing the joke, as issues regarding power and cultural identity are never far below the surface? I'm currently thinking around how maybe a specific and highly theory-underpinned analysis of the difference in that situation I've referred to between parody and its possibilities to include homage to the subject it is parodying, and satire, challenging a political norm, often in a critical way, and caricature can operate in terms of pedagogy. Humour, which symbolises othering, can be emotionally disquieting. The notion of disruption via performance is important, and humour and comedy can certainly offer that kind of disruption. But at what point does that disruption then, can it become something which can create unnecessary stress or have the undesired effect? So I hope that summarised some of those points that you've been making, that have been made today. There's times in class when I think, how are the students reacting to what I'm saying? Do I need to do something? Do I need to draw upon my background in performance as a way of quick-firing their imaginations? How will a joke help? I have to assess each class on an individual level. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I like to take the risk. Okay, thank you.
So a big thank you to all of the panellists and Lee as the discussant, and they've given us an awful lot to think about. And what I'd like to do now is to open up the floor to questions. I can't remember, Karina, what the name of that thing is. Can you remind us? The catch box. So for those of you that weren't here this morning, the catch box contains a little microphone, and it can be thrown around in the teaching space or in any other meeting space you like, and it allows people to ask questions. So we thought that we would make use of that in our session this afternoon. So questions, if your question is particularly directed to somebody, then please let us know. Otherwise, I'll channel those questions as they come in. So have I got a first willing volunteer to get us started? Thank you very much. See, it's about how good your catching, your throwing skills are. The pressure of throwing and catching.
Yeah, thank you very much all. Basically, my question is, thank you very much, first of all, for all the amazing talks. So, in some way, I would direct my question to Shazia, but it's open. And the question is, one thing that I got was she had a message at the end, and then there were loads of jokes. So at the end of that, I was thinking, okay, so as a tutor or as a lecturer, how then do you strike a balance between those jokes and then embedding your message or what you want the students to actually grasp in that message so that they don't get lost in the jokes and then actually not get the message.
Lovely, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Shazia, did you want to respond to that question? A thought about how people might respond to the jokes in sessions, or would you rather throw that to somebody else on the panel?
Does anybody else want to answer it? Mark?
Did you want to?
Okay.
Nah. Do I have an answer for it? I don't have like a definitive answer for that question. Thanks for the question. It is a difficult balance. There is no easy answer.
Yep.
That's my soundbite answer. But I think there's a lot going on here in terms of themes, particularly when Lee was talking about the idea of comedy as provocation. You do, as a stand-up comedian and as a stand-up comedian, obviously you want to get laughs, you want kind of reactions, but you also do have moments where you've designed, either on purpose or within the moment, you realise, we've seen it today, where there's a big subject, it needs to pause, it needs to sit in the room. So that might sound like it's just a technical thing, a practical thing, but it's about that kind of rhythm of stand-up. You get quite used to it, you know, the rule of three, that's how jokes work, and all that kind of stuff that I'm sure lots of us know. You can use that to your advantage. So you can go, bam, here's a joke, bam, here's a joke. This is not a joke. Right there, you laughed because you felt deeply uncomfortable because I pitched it just on the sweet spot there. So that's why I love stand-up comedy. You can talk about the biggest things. What I'm hearing from your question, tell me if I'm taking over, I'm a bit chatty. From what I understood from your question, there's a worry behind that education might get lost in comedy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like you have a main point, and then it's really interesting because like the students might go away if it's a joke, and then even like in the, I don't know, dormitory or whatever, and then discuss about it. It's amazing. But then you're like, like striking a balance between, okay, this is an amazing joke, like for them to actually grasp what you're saying.
Yeah.
And then actually put in the main message along with the joke.
Well, okay, I do have an answer for you. It's storytelling. It's good storytelling.
Okay.
The rule of three exists because it's the shortest, most concise story that you can tell. It often has a punch or a punchline at the end, which is a surprise. It's incongruous. But humor can highlight difficult points as much as it can distract. It depends in whose hands it's in.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You. Anybody want to add anything else to that one? Should we take another question?
And just make the comment that, I never make gags as such, but sometimes, you can make observations. But it's a difference. The difference is, if you've got a relatively small group, you kind of get to know them, don't you? And you can feel what works. Whereas if it's a very large group, it can be, you make a mistake, I think, sometimes, because you don't know them very well. So I think knowing them really does help, isn't it, if you're going to try and use humour.
I agree. I'd also say that's probably the same with stand-up. With a good stand-up room, you don't want a big arena. You want a small, uncomfortable basement in Edinburgh where people are packed together, because groups tend to act as one. So like today, for example, we've got lots of little disparate things that we were just talking about earlier in terms of like as a stand-up comedian, this is a tough room. This is a tough room to work. And we saw it being worked excellently here today, but it is difficult. I think in terms of when we're talking about that kind of lots of energy, noticed, Finton, you were talking a lot about sort of pushing energy into the room. It's a two-way process. So what's great about stand-up is you put energy in, you get energy back, and I think that's why a lot of people do it, because there's nothing else like it, except teaching.
Great, thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you
Other
very much.
questions, please? Oh,
Should be
you
a
pass it, not throw it.
Gentle passing. I'm just wondering the panel's thoughts about using humour when dealing with a high proportion of international students.
Hannah, did you want to?
I teach Commedia dell'arte sometimes, and one of the techniques that they used is called Grammalot, and it's gibberish. It's a nonsense language, but it's very expressive. So you get the feeling of exactly of what someone is saying from how they're saying it, and so that's a really good strategy to sort of get people maybe who or even just on there's some language issues around sharing humor. That's a fun sort of technique to play with. But the other, explaining the joke that you had to have, I don't know, grown up and watched TV in this country or something to get, right? That can be part of the process of involving humor in the classroom and sort of building that shared cultural understanding. While some humor might sort of at first create maybe like an in-group and an out-group, and those who are in on the joke and those who aren't, then just sort of encouraging students to take that further and bring each other into it, I think is probably a useful strategy.
Lovely, thank you. Anybody else?
Can I just add that we had exactly that issue because the people who were doing this Bursting Brunel bubble were Brits, and I don't think they understood. I mean, I would have told them if I'd realised how many international students were there. So there were some cultural allusions that just passed them by, So that is something to be conscious of. So yeah, good question.
Build on that for a minute. Something you talked earlier about the Greeks didn't really respect comedy as much. That's true. One of the big things that John Morial talks about is the fact there is a reason that we don't take comedy seriously. Even just saying that sounds odd, I know, but Aristotle believed this is where superiority theory comes from. So Aristotle believed that humour's only use was to make certain people seem superior, or political parties or things seem superior, and others seem inferior. We've talked a lot about sort of inside and outside, in groups and out groups. So there can be a dark side to comedy that is very important to keep in check. But the thing about superiority theory is it suggests that everything has winners and losers. What about self-deprecation? If I make a joke about myself, do I win? Or do I lose? Or do I both? I have no idea. It's one of the theories that it's irritating that is so pervasive, but you can go looking for winners and losers in anything if you want. There are other theories that I think better explain how humour can be beneficial, but there can be a dark side to humour.
I need a microphone because this isn't. Oh, actually it is. Yeah, just going back to that point about international students, we've been, most of the nature of the humour or comedy we've been talking about has been verbal, but I'm also interested in non-verbal humour, like slapstick or bodily humour. When I first started teaching in an EFL setting, yes, I would sometimes crack jokes, and some students would get it, some students wouldn't. But I just remember at the end of class or at the end of a term, put on Mr. Bean, pretty much most of them would find it funny because they didn't need to understand language in order to be able to find it funny. It's amazing how much they laughed at Mr. Bean falling over or, early, put on a Charlie Chaplin. I think that's quite interesting, that difference between verbal and non-verbal forms of expression.
Okay, another question. An opportunity to throw the catch box.
Oh.
Down the front. Yes.
Yeah, throw it at Go on, throw it. So thanks, everyone. I've got a question, but it's still forming in my mind, so it might not come out exactly right. It's a question about quality control, I suppose, in a way, using humour in the classroom. So I guess if you're a professional stand-up comedian and you're good, and we saw an example of that this evening, you're in control to a great extent of the audience. But if you're not very good, I guess the control flips and the audience can boo you off or whatever. The relationship with authority, if you like, in the classroom is very different, where often you can be a rubbish teacher, but still for years you carry on because students often can be a bit loath to criticise you or whatever because they're worried about their marks and so on. So if you add on to that you know, the authority figure in the classroom, you think you're funny, but you're not very funny. It seems to me, a real danger there of a misuse of power, a misuse of authority. And I just wonder if you are, you know, if you consider the danger of that, if you like.
Well, can I make a comment first and say, yes, I'm very aware of that danger, and I don't make gags, fundamentally. It's you know, you're really opening yourself up, aren't you? You know, I mean, if I had the confidence that you have, you know, then maybe you could do it. But yeah, there's a great risk, I think, if you do try and be funny and you're not funny. That's worse than just keeping it completely straight, I think. Yeah. So just want to give that proviso.
Sorry, who's making this?
Ricky Gervais.
Well, lots of stand-ups have been teachers at some point. Greg Davis, oh God, I'm struggling to think of them now. There's been loads and loads. Do you mind if I just build on that idea?
Shazia was a teacher. No, Shazia was a teacher.
Oh, I didn't know you were a teacher too. I'm sorry for your loss. Yeah, I used to. Sorry. Yes, you're right. It is a difficult, again, it's a bit like the previous question, it's a difficult balance. I realised on my way here today that I'm not sure I agree with the title, Comedy in the Classroom. I don't think teachers should be funny, necessarily. I think the point is that, I'm going to be focused particularly on stand-up comedy because it's both verbal and performative and so on, that the lesson to be learned is the means of communication rather than let's tell more gags in class. I'm not sure that anyone on the panel would suggest that. I'm open to suggestions.
Hannah, would you?
Gags? Loony gags?
I think unlike Fenton, I make tons of jokes all the time, teaching or not. And I think it's important to model that for particularly women, female students, because it is a risk. It is a risk to make that proposal, and then you learn something if it fails, right? And you have to recover. Now, if you're on stage, you know, some stand-ups are very good at recovering the laugh that falls sort of flat. Eddie Izzard's famous for like bringing out his little notebook and saying, "Never do that bit again," right? Yeah. And you know, you can sort of just learn from the risk and power that being a person who is able to pull together two things, or more than two things, and change the breath of everyone in the room. That's an enormously sort of powerful thing. And we say power, like it's not always a bad thing. I think it's a good thing to model powerful communication strategies in the classroom. That's my perspective.
Thank you. Any further? No?
Bill?
Can I say something more? Do you mind?
Please, yeah.
It sort of relates to the point you were making that I used to tell a gag in class, and it was as an introduction to Freud.
Here we
Talking
go.
about Freud. No, I won't. Well, actually, it's a filthy gag, of course, because it's
Oh, then here we go.
Freud, and it does involve a donkey. But I used to, the last time I taught that course was about 10 years ago, and I would never tell that joke anymore.
Ah, interesting.
So the joke is the same, but of course, the social, cultural situation, the makeup of the classroom has changed to the extent where I just don't think I could tell that joke anymore, even though it's a great joke and even though it's a great pathway into Freud. But I just feel that too many people would be offended that it just wouldn't be worth it.
Thank you.
That's a good point.
It's just an observation rather than anything
Thank
else. Anyone want this square thing?
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Right at the back. Way.
Nice. Oh. That was the point made this morning about this. That can raise a laugh of its own, that little catch box.
Wow, life in 2019. This thing. Yeah, so I'm a white male Guardian reader, so I guess I should just check out now, stop talking. But no, I thought, again, it's interesting, just as he was finishing his point, the point I was going to make was about offence and being offended. And I was trying to think of something that tied all the things that you were saying together. I didn't quite manage to get all of you in, but there were lots of things that you were saying that kind of linked. But yeah, so you had the lady on the right saying, okay, often people say things that they don't really, like bigoted things that they don't really believe, but they kind of emerge through jokes and things like that. You had the other gentleman saying, you know, sometimes comedy and jokes can kind of backfire, and you've got, again, this kind of thing of being offended. And you had Miss Mirza as well saying this thing of like, yeah, so, being offended is a pastime. Like, and there seems to be like a lot of pushback against being offended nowadays, but do you not think, I guess, to kind of summarize this rambling question or whatever, or to turn it not into a statement, to turn it into an actual question, like, do you not think that the reason why people are being offended is because they're realizing now that there's this sort of pushback from the people who are bigoted to saying, no, you can't be offended at us, and then now these people who are trying to say, oh, actually, we should be offended, and there's this sort of toing and froing, but there is a reason to be offended, do you not think? I don't know, like, that was it, basically. Like, when, like you were saying, like, as in, yeah, like, I'm worried about, like, that, saying something like that, like, being offended is in pastime, and people say you shouldn't be offended, is kind of a way of silencing the kind of SJW side of things, and that actually we should be offended, and, yeah. Like, I know it's a very unfunny point and question to make.
It's a big question. Just a really quick practical thing. I think something interesting about stand-up that's similar to improv is that yes, you come with prepared material, but you're editing and you're writing on the hoof, right then and there. And a bit like with improv, there's the reason that people enjoy improv and they go and see, you know, long form, short form improv, is that they know it's being written on the hoof and there are going to be mistakes. That's the mystique, that's the danger behind it. Someone might say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. In the moment, in the context of stand-up comedy or improv or that kind of performance, you've got those kind of inverted, you know, comedy is meant to be taken ironically, and you know, we all know that it's happening here and now. Mistakes are going to happen. So you have the opportunity to you know, go back on what you said or take the piss out of what you just said. You can turn the joke back on you and the fact that you didn't get it. Whereas something like social media and something that's written, it suggests that someone's taken lots of time and this is really what they think, which is why, excuse my French, but I get so pissed off when jokes are put next to what politicians say, because a politician is a completely different context where they've probably not even written it anyway, whereas a joke is all about that performative context where things are allowed to be wrong, things are allowed to be provocative, things are allowed to be difficult. Conflating those two different contexts, I think that's a mistake. I'll shut up now.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question? Have any other questions?
I'm just wondering whether the panel could comment on, you talked a lot about the role as a teacher or lecturer and their use of humour. What about perhaps encouraging the students' use of humour within the classroom? Or comedy? However.
Yeah, Hannah or Elise, surely. Yeah.
The students producing the humour themselves? The students using humour
Yeah, so
between
whether
themselves?
it's stand-up comedy techniques or the use of humour, as it were, but is there a way of sort of flipping that back to encourage the students to be using that?
Okay. Hannah?
Well, I mean, I actually teach comedy practice, so I mean, you know, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do that. So I won't sort of maybe go into my entire pedagogy on that, but I think, yeah, creating a warm room. I would never let my students sit in a room like this. I mean, we would come down together. You know, I warm them up, but I do. You know, like on my first stand-up class, that everyone gets up, you know, and give them the gift of, as pardon my literal French here, when Philippe Goulier says being in the shit, yes, giving you the gift of possibly failing, and that's fine, you know, of creating a space where failure is productive, is probably the most important thing about teaching student comedy.
I had a really awkward situation, which certainly had humour and unwanted and wanted, that the students produced. We were talking. I was doing a session on collaboration and group working, and I wanted to do something that was a bit more dynamic than just me doing my endless PowerPoint. So I got students to. Divided the class into two, and I said to one group to go outside and prepare a short speech, or like not comedy, but just some sort of performative act. Could be telling a joke, whatever. And then they would come back in, and I wanted the other group, who had time to prepare while the others were outside rehearsing, to interrupt them, to basically act as hecklers. And obviously the group didn't know that was going to happen. So the other group came in, started to, I think they were saying some jokes, and then halfway through, some of the other students started to throw aeroplanes, started to boo. Yeah, it's all a bit. Now, I want you to bear in mind that this was a peer-observed session. Yeah, because I was doing a part of continuing professional development program. It was peer-reviewed. Sorry, peer observed. One student, and this certainly provoked a laugh, got up and stripped off to his underpants. That was his interruption. And I thought, what the hell? The observer didn't batter an eyelid. And then this other girl stood up and got her coat and walked out. And people started to laugh, and I started to look.
Timing.
Yeah.
Good timing.
And I thought, what the hell has happened? Was she so uncomfortable that she had to leave? Was that her interruption? I just simply didn't know. So that kind of moment where art and life comes into the classroom. Now, actually, then she. And I looked at my students because I thought, my God, this makes me look really bad in front of the observer. What are they thinking? It then transpired that when the girl came back in about 20 minutes later, that was her interruption. She said, I didn't think you'd really notice. But actually, she created the biggest interruption than the guy stripping off to his underpants. Students were laughing at that moment, but it was a real nervous form of laughter, like, how on earth is the observer going to make sense of what's going on here? How's it going to look in terms of Lee? All of these different dynamics. Going back to the power dynamics in the room were just huge. So, like, again, we talk about performing gags or jokes, but it's those little moments, those kind of serendipitous moments that can produce wanted and unwanted forms of laughter or comedy that I find so fascinating, which you can't always plan for. But then it's what, then in that moment, then what happens? Do you then have time to discuss it or go into what actually happened, to actually suitably unpack that?
Lovely. So that seems like a really good place to end. All right then, Bill.
Can I ask a question to you? What do you think of all this?
It's never funny when you talk about comedy, is it? When you dissect it and talk about it like that, it's just never funny. And comedians are about being funny. So I never think of it this deeply or this analytically. I just think about, you know, the narrative, what I want to say, how I'm going to make this funny, how I'm going to get to the audience. It's a very direct and simple thing for a comedian. We think of an idea and then we think of a joke. And that's it. And how they think is unlike how we think.
Okay, so thank you all very much. I need to thank the panellists enormously. So Hannah, Martin, Fintan, Lee and Shazia, it's been a really, really interesting afternoon. And we're very, very pleased and very grateful to all of you for your time and your thoughts and your comments and your presentation. So thank you very much. What I'd like to just briefly finish by is, as a result of the kinds of discussions that Sharon and Simon and I have been having during the course of the year around the seminar series and this particular event, one of the things that's become really interesting for us is stories, and the stories about comedy in the classroom and the way in which comedy is used or the way in which comedy appears. And Clandon and Connolly refer to classrooms being, for the most part, safe spaces, generally free from scrutiny, depending on where you are in time, of course, and the kind of ideologies underpinning the education context that you're in, but where teachers are free to live stories of practice, and that these lived stories are essentially secret ones. So what we want to try to do is we want to try and explore a little bit more about these secret stories that particularly relate to funny things that have happened in the classroom. And we've set up an online survey, which we've shared certainly within the community, and I think went out with the information for the event, but we'll certainly do that as a follow-up afterwards. But we would be delighted to hear your stories about funny things that may well have happened in the classroom. And as with the discussion we've had, they may be intentional, they may be unintentional, they may have been, you know, structured and set up. They may be about things that were entirely unexpected. Having taught in secondary schools for 12 years before coming here and having been here for 15 years, there have been some very interesting, funny stories, which I won't share with you now. However, what we would like to do as well is invite you to join us for a drink, to thank you all very, very much for coming. The drinks, wine reception will just be out in the atrium. And it's been really good to see you all, and thank you all for your questions and contributions.